The great King Henry VIII of England once stood as a titan among men, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, and larger than life. He was a man whose word could build or destroy, whose appetite for power and pleasure knew no limits. He was the kind of ruler whose gaze could make noblemen tremble, and whose laughter filled the grand halls of his court like music. But time, as it always does, came to collect its due. By the winter of 1546, Henry was no longer the radiant monarch who had once dazzled the world. His eyes, once bright with ambition, were dull now, sunken beneath heavy lids. His body, once vigorous and strong, had become a prison of pain and decay. He was 55, but he looked far older. The years had not been kind, and neither had he. Gone was the handsome king who had captivated England with his charm and confidence. What remained was a swollen, tormented figure who could barely walk, a man so heavy and diseased that special mechanical hoists had to be built just to lift him from his bed. He wheezed when he breathed, grunted when he moved, and roared when the pain became too great to bear. His courtiers spoke softly now, not out of respect, but out of fear, because the once mighty Henry VIII was dying, and everyone in his palace could smell it. It began with his legs. Years earlier, a jousting accident had left him with deep wounds that never properly healed. Those wounds turned to ulcers, wide, gaping and infected. They festered, leaking blood and pus that soaked through his bandages. The odor that clung to him was unbearable, so foul that courtiers could hardly stand near him for long. Even his physicians, those sworn to care for him, had to mask their disgust behind perfumed cloths. The king knew. He saw it in their eyes. The pity, the fear, the horror. Sometimes he would scream in agony, so violently that the sound echoed through Whitehall Palace at night. Servants would freeze, waiting for the cries to stop. The king's pain had become the pulse of the palace, the sound that ruled England now. But the pain wasn't only in his flesh. It had taken root deeper, in his mind. Henry VIII, once proud and invincible, began to see things that weren't there. He woke drenched in sweat, whispering the names of the women he had loved and destroyed. Anne, Catherine, Jane. They haunted him like shadows at the edge of his vision. Sometimes he would claim he had seen them standing in the dark corners of his chamber, their faces pale and still. Anne Boleyn, the brilliant, seductive woman he had defied the Pope for, appeared to him, holding her own severed head in her hands, whispering that he had doomed himself for nothing. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, stood beside her, clutching a rosary, her eyes heavy with the sorrow of betrayal. Jane Seymour, the only one who had given him a son, wept silently, her tears falling for the life she lost in childbirth. Henry, who once mocked superstition, began to fear his own reflection. He ordered candles to burn through the night, afraid of the darkness, because in that darkness his sins were waiting. His courtiers began to speak in whispers, avoiding the king's gaze. They said his soul was restless, that he muttered prayers one moment and cursed heaven the next. They said he begged forgiveness and then condemned priests in the same breath. They said he was losing his mind, but to say such words aloud was treason. Even dying, Henry VIII remained dangerous. The king's paranoia grew sharper as his body grew weaker. He trusted no one, not his council, not his friends, not even his wife. Catherine Parr, his sixth queen, tried to comfort him, to ease the fevered storms of his mind. But when she spoke of faith and scripture, Henry's suspicion flared. He began to think she was plotting against him, scheming to undermine him like the others before her. He ordered her arrest. Guards were sent to drag her to the Tower. But fate, or perhaps cunning, intervened. Catherine learned of the order and fell at Henry's feet, sobbing, insisting she only sought to learn from his great wisdom. The king, swollen with pride and confusion, melted. He embraced her, calling her his sweetheart again. And when the guards arrived the next morning with the warrant, Henry exploded in fury, condemning them for daring to question his queen. That was Henry's madness now. His moods turned like the wind, affection 1 hour, destruction the next. His power, once absolute, had become the weapon that cut him apart. England trembled beneath him. Beyond the palace walls, his kingdom was cracking. The monasteries he had torn down lay in ruins. The Church of England, his greatest act of defiance, had become a battleground for faith and rebellion. The people whispered prayers they no longer knew were safe to say. Some cursed him quietly, calling him a tyrant. Others worshipped him as God's chosen ruler. But all feared him, even as he rotted before their eyes. The king who had split a continent apart now found himself split between body and soul. By late December, snow blanketed London, muting the world in cold silence. Inside Whitehall, the king lay trapped in his bed, surrounded by the flicker of candlelight and the smell of death. His body was swollen beyond recognition. His breath rattled like a broken bellows. The ulcers on his legs had turned black, the infection spreading through his body. He could no longer rise. He could no longer eat without choking. And yet he clung to life. Some nights, he called out for his son, Edward, the boy who was meant to carry his legacy forward. Other nights, he called for God. But mostly, he called for his wives, one by one, as if begging for something he had never learned to give, forgiveness. Those who kept watch over him said they sometimes heard him whisper to the empty air. They said he reached for things no one could see. Some claimed that when the candles flickered, they caught glimpses of shadows moving at his bedside. Shapes that vanished when they blinked. Whether ghosts or guilt, only Henry knew. The king who had once stood above all men now lay helpless, drowning in his own decay. And though no one dared say it aloud, every soul in that palace knew the truth. Death had entered the room. It had been patient, watching from the corners, waiting for its moment. And now, it had come to claim the man who had once believed he could conquer even God. The cold winter of 1547 crept into Whitehall Palace like a silent executioner. Outside, the Thames had frozen over, its surface coated in a layer of pale ice that gleamed under moonlight. Inside the palace, every corridor was dimly lit, every corner filled with fear and whispers. The king, once the very symbol of England's might, was dying, and all of London seemed to hold its breath. Henry VIII, the man who had defied the Pope, rewritten the laws of heaven and earth, and sent countless souls to their deaths, now lay captive in his own body. His massive frame, once the envy of every noble, had become a grotesque shell. His face was puffed and pallid, his lips cracked and blue. His breathing came in heavy, uneven gasps that echoed to the chamber like a distant drumbeat, counting down his final moments. Those who attended him did so with dread. They knew the king's temper could flare at any moment, even now. A careless glance, a misplaced word, could mean ruin or death. The servants moved in silence, tending to his wounds, changing his sheets soaked with pus and sweat, whispering prayers under their breath. The smell of infection was so strong that even the thickest perfumes could not mask it. Each day began with pain. Each night ended with madness. Sometimes, in his fevered delirium, Henry would shout for his armor. He believed he was still on the battlefield, leading his men to glory. His voice would rise to a hoarse roar, commanding imaginary soldiers, cursing phantom traitors. Then, as quickly as it came, the energy would fade, leaving him trembling and broken. When his physicians tried to soothe him with medicine, he struck them away. "Did you think me weak?" he would growl, eyes flashing with the same fury that once terrified Europe. But the truth was crueler than pride. His body was no longer his command. The ulcers in his legs had grown so deep that the infection reached his bones. His flesh was dying from the inside. Each touch was agony. The bandages stuck to his skin, tearing away bits of flesh when removed. At night, the sheets clung to the sores, soaked in blood. The pain was constant, sharp, gnawing, and unrelenting. He had become a prisoner of his own kingdom, trapped within a body that refused to die quickly. Outside his chamber, his courtiers fought their own battles. With the king slipping toward death, the vultures began to circle. The question of succession hung over England like a storm cloud. His son, Edward, was just 9 years old, too young to rule, too fragile to hold power in a court filled with wolves. The council whispered in the shadows, plotting alliances, drafting wills, each man desperate to carve his place in the world that would come after Henry. But none dared show their true intentions, not while the king still drew breath, because Henry VIII was not yet dead, and the dying lion still had claws. One evening, Sir Anthony Denny, the king's most trusted servant, stood by his bedside. The room was quiet except for the low crackle of the fire and the wet rasp of Henry's breathing. Denny hesitated before speaking. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "it is time to prepare your soul." Henry's eyes snapped open, small, watery, and full of fury. "You dare say I am dying?" he hissed. Denny bowed his head. "No, sire, but the time draws near. It would be wise to make peace with God." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then his lips curved into something that was almost a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Peace," he murmured. "I made peace when I took his church for my own." But as the night wore on, those words lost their power. The truth pressed against his chest heavier than his failing heart. He had broken from Rome, destroyed monasteries, executed priests, and branded himself defender of the faith. Yet faith itself had abandoned him. The man who once believed himself chosen by God now wondered if God had turned his face away. He began to dream again, dreams that blurred into waking visions. The walls around him seemed to shift, the candlelight flickering in strange patterns. He saw faces in the shadows. Thomas More, his old friend and advisor, smiling sadly before his executioner's axe fell. Cardinal Fisher, his faithful bishop, rising from the flames of martyrdom to stare at him with hollow eyes. And above them all, the figure of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had started it all, drifting closer, her dark hair falling like silk across her pale face. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to twist the knife of memory deeper into his heart. He would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, gasping for air that seemed to grow thinner each night. The palace priest came to his bedside, offering prayers and absolution. Henry waved them away. "I am not done," he said through gritted teeth. "Not yet." But everyone knew the truth. The king's strength was gone. Even lifting a cup of wine required help. When he slept, his face turned gray, his breathing shallow. His servants would watch in silence, wondering if he would wake again. But somehow, he always did, clinging to life with the stubbornness of a man who refused to surrender. Yet even kings cannot outlast their own hearts. By mid-January, Henry's body was collapsing. His legs were swollen and blackened. His stomach had distended grotesquely, filled with infection. His physicians no longer spoke of healing, only of comfort. They feared that if the pressure in his abdomen burst, it would kill him instantly. Some nights, the sound of his groans echoed down the corridors. The servants prayed he would pass quietly, but the king's suffering seemed endless. He began speaking to himself, whispering to the empty room. Sometimes he spoke to God, sometimes to his son, sometimes to the ghosts. "I was not cruel," he muttered one night. "I did what must be done. A king must do what others will not." The words trembled in the air, half confession, half defiance. Sir Denny returned, braver this time. He knelt beside the bed and said softly, "Your Majesty, no man is above God. It is time." Henry's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes glistened with tears he could no longer hide. For the first time, the king who ruled with iron and fire looked afraid. He turned his gaze toward the window, where the faint light of dawn was beginning to creep through the frost. He whispered something only Denny could hear. A question, small and broken. "Do you think he will forgive me?" Denny's voice cracked. "Yes, sire, if you ask him truly." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes distant. Then, with what strength remained, he whispered, "Then let him judge me as he judged all men." The candles flickered. The air grew still. That night, as the wind howled through the frozen streets of London, Henry VIII slipped in and out of consciousness. He murmured fragments of prayers, a mix of Latin and English, the two languages that had defined his reign. The priests anointed his forehead with oil, their hands trembling as they spoke the words of final blessing. And in the dim light of dawn, with only a handful of witnesses by his side, the king who had once commanded nations took his last, shuddering breath. The silence that followed was heavy, not peaceful, but thick with dread. For those who stood there swore. They felt something in the room, a presence that lingered after life had left him. Some said it was the weight of his sins. Others believed it was the souls of the thousands he had condemned, come to witness the fall of their His chest rose one last time, and then it stopped. Henry VIII, the man who had lived like a god, died like a man, alone, afraid, and surrounded by the echoes of his own cruelty. And somewhere, deep within the shadows of the palace, a candle went out. The morning after the king's death, London awoke to an uneasy silence. Snow still blanketed the streets, muffling the city's usual noise, and over Whitehall Palace hung a heavy, motionless fog. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wax, wine, and decay. Courtiers walked in slow, hushed steps, their eyes downcast, as though speaking too loudly might wake the monster they had served in fear and awe for nearly 4 decades. Henry VIII, the once mighty lion of England, was gone, but even in death, his presence lingered. His shadow stretched across every room, every corridor. For so long, his will had been law. Now, with his final breath, he had left behind a kingdom poised on the edge of chaos. Sir Anthony Denny, who had witnessed the king's last words, stood near the deathbed, staring at the lifeless face that only hours ago had been twisted with defiance. Henry's lips were pale, his eyes half open, staring at nothing. The mighty chest that once held the roar of a conqueror was still. For the first time, there was peace in the room, but it did not feel like mercy. It felt like the eerie quiet that follows a storm, when everyone waits to see what has been destroyed. No trumpet sounded. No priest announced the passing. Word of the king's death was smothered, whispered only among a few trusted men, because they knew, if the news spread too quickly, England could tear itself apart. A dead king meant opportunity. A dead king meant danger. His son, Edward, was just a child, frail and small. The men of court, ambitious, cunning, hungry for power, were already moving behind closed doors, positioning themselves to control the boy and, through him, the throne. The struggle for England's soul had already begun, even as Henry's body still lay warm. For 2 days they kept his death secret. They sealed his chambers, dismissed servants, and ordered silence. Only a handful of attendants remained to tend to the corpse. But tending to Henry VIII's body was not a task for the faint of heart. By the 2nd day, the king's corpse began to change. His body, bloated in life, swelled grotesquely in death. His skin turned purple and mottled, the odor so powerful that attendants gagged even behind their perfumed kerchiefs. The ulcers that plagued him in life split open, oozing black fluid. The once royal flesh had become a horror. They dressed him in fine garments, silk, velvet, and gold, as was expected for a king. They sealed his coffin with lead and wrapped it in layers of linen and herbs to contain the stench. But nothing could mask it. When the coffin was finally closed, one of the servants crossed himself and whispered, "God forgive him, and God forgive us all." In the great halls of Whitehall, courtiers continued to feast, pretending that nothing had happened. They toasted the king's good health, even as his body lay rotting a few rooms away. Behind the curtain of celebration, however, the machinery of succession was already turning. Henry's death warrant had set in motion a storm that would consume England for years. At last, when the council had secured power and young Edward was declared heir, the news broke across the city. Bells tolled. Messengers rode through the streets, shouting that the great King Henry VIII had gone to his rest. But the people of England did not rejoice. Some wept, some crossed themselves, but many simply stared into the cold air, unsure how to feel. For Henry had been both savior and tyrant, the man who gave him the Church of England and the man who had drenched their land in blood. To some, his death was a tragedy. To others, it was justice. In his will, Henry had demanded a magnificent funeral, a procession worthy of his divine rule. The preparations took weeks. His coffin was carried from Whitehall to Windsor, where he would be laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he claimed to have truly loved. It was a bitter irony. The woman who had died giving him the son he so desperately wanted was now to share his eternal bed. The procession was long and somber. Hundreds followed the coffin through the snow, nobles, priests, soldiers, and servants. Black banners fluttered in the wind. The roads were lined with mourners and onlookers, some genuine in their grief, others there only to witness the passing of an era. But even in death, Henry's body seemed unwilling to rest quietly. The journey from London to Windsor was slow and cold, and the coffin, though sealed, began to leak. The gases inside had built up, swelling the corpse until the metal casing strained under the pressure. Somewhere near Sion Abbey, the procession stopped for the night. The coffin was placed in a chapel to await morning. As the candles burned low, a strange sound echoed through the silence. A faint hiss, then a muffled pop. When attendants entered the chapel at dawn, they recoiled in horror. The coffin had cracked open during the night. A dark fluid had seeped out onto the floor, forming a thick, foul-smelling puddle beneath the altar. The stench was unbearable. Superstitious servants whispered that it was the devil himself claiming the king's remains. Others recalled an old prophecy, one spoken years before by a Franciscan friar who had dared to call Henry a tyrant. The friar had said that dogs would lick the king's blood when he died. And now, as the attendants looked on, a stray dog had indeed wandered into the chapel, its muzzle stained as it lapped at the dark liquid beneath the coffin. The story spread like wildfire. Some said it was a sign of divine judgment. Others dismissed it as coincidence. But to those who had lived under Henry's rule, it was something more, a chilling reminder that even kings could not escape the reckoning of their deeds. The procession continued, though the men carrying the coffin did so with pale faces and trembling hands. When they finally reached St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the bells tolled long into the night. The burial ceremony was solemn, grand, and heavy with hypocrisy. The priest spoke of Henry's faith, his courage, his divine wisdom, words that fell hollow in the cold echo of the stone chamber. Few dared speak of the broken wives, the fallen friends, the bodies left in the wake of his reign. His coffin was lowered beside Jane Seymour's, and the tomb was sealed. The crown of England had passed to his son, but the shadow of Henry VIII would never truly leave the land. In the years that followed, people would claim that Henry's spirit haunted Windsor. Guards reported hearing footsteps echoing in the night, the slow, heavy tread of boots that seemed too large for any man alive. Some swore they saw his ghost, a hulking, broad-shouldered figure limping to the corridors, his face half hidden in shadow, his eyes burning with fury and regret. They said that when the wind howled across the Thames on cold winter nights, it carried his voice, a low, mournful growl, muttering the names of his wives, his victims, his enemies, Anne, Catherine, Jane, and sometimes his own. For Henry VIII had built his kingdom on power and blood. He had severed England from Rome, reshaped fate itself, and declared himself above God's will. But in the end, no king, not even one who made himself divine, could rule over death. His body turned to dust, his palaces to ruins, his throne to memory. But his story, the story of the man who feared nothing except the weight of his own sins, lived on, and in that silent chapel, where the candles still burn and the air is cold with history, one can almost hear the echo of his voice whispering through the stones. I am still king. By 1546, the great King Henry VIII was no longer the towering lion who had once thundered to the palaces of England. His once broad shoulders sagged, his body grotesquely swollen, and his face, once striking, had turned pale and monstrous. He hid behind layers of silk and furs, but no amount of royal finery could conceal the truth. Death was approaching, and Henry knew it. Every step was a torment. His ulcerated leg, now oozing and blackened, emitted a stench so unbearable that courtiers fainted or wept upon entering his chamber. The king himself could not escape the smell of his own decay. The royal physicians, terrified of displeasing him, lied through trembling lips, claiming he would recover. But they all knew Henry was rotting alive. In his bed at Whitehall Palace, the once mighty monarch now spent his days raging at ghosts. He saw the faces of his wives, the pale, weeping ghost of Catherine of Aragon, the severed head of Anne Boleyn, and the still, broken body of Jane Seymour. They came to him in feverish dreams, whispering accusations, prayers, and curses. Henry would awaken drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a war drum, shouting their names into the darkness. Sometimes he would call for music to drown the voices, flutes, viols, lutes, but even the most soothing melodies could not silence the echoes of the dead. His court musicians played tremblingly as Henry stared into the fire, muttering to himself about betrayal, power, and God's will. As his body failed, so did his mind. His temper grew monstrous. Servants lived in terror, for a single misstep could lead to execution. Henry's paranoia reached new heights. He believed his counselors plotted against him, that his own physicians sought to poison him, and that even his food was cursed. He ordered endless tests and tastings before daring a single bite. The royal kitchens became a place of whispered dread, as men prayed not to be chosen for service near the king's table. But despite his fury, there was one thing Henry could not command: sleep. The pain in his leg was relentless. Night after night, he lay awake, trembling and moaning, the sheets stained with blood and pus. The swelling had spread to his abdomen, his skin splitting under its own pressure. Physicians applied poultices of honey, herbs, and wine, but nothing soothed the agony. His body was becoming his own torture chamber, and as his health declined, his enemies waited. Many in his court, once fearful of his wrath, began preparing for his death. Ambitious nobles schemed for influence over the young Prince Edward, his only male heir. Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, tended him dutifully, though even she feared the unpredictable storm that still flickered in his soul. She had narrowly escaped accusations of heresy months before, and she knew that if the king's rage flared again, it could cost her head. Henry's confessions grew strange. He would summon bishops and demand that they assure him of his salvation. He spoke of his wars, his wives, his reforms, seeking some divine sign that his actions had been righteous. But deep down, even Henry feared that his sins were too great to wash away. By January 1547, the end was undeniable. His body was breaking down completely. He could no longer stand. His swollen form required mechanical hoists just to move from bed to chair. His courtiers carried him like a relic. This once mighty king, who once stood taller than all men, now reduced to a helpless giant of flesh and guilt. The palace became a tomb in waiting. Fires burned constantly to mask the stench. Candles were lit day and night, their smoke thick and choking in the air. Even the walls seemed to groan under the weight of the king's misery. And still, no one dared tell him the truth, that death was near, for to say so would be to sign one's own death warrant. The courtiers whispered it only in secret. The lion dies, but the lion refused to surrender. Henry summoned his will one final time. He ordered legal documents signed, preparing for the future of his kingdom, deciding who would guide young Edward after his death. But even then, his decisions were fueled by suspicion. He cut down some of his most trusted men, fearing betrayal even as his heart faltered. Then, one cold January night, the silence broke. Henry called for Sir Anthony Denny, his groom of the stool, one of the few men who dared approach him in those final hours. The king's voice was hoarse, weak, but still carried the remnants of command. "I know I am dying," Henry whispered. "Do not lie to me." For the first time, Denny spoke the truth. "Yes, your majesty. Death is near. It is time to prepare your soul." Henry fell silent. For a long time, he stared at the fire, his massive frame trembling. Then he asked for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the man who had once helped him break from Rome and establish the Church of England. But when Cranmer arrived, Henry could no longer speak. His throat was dry, his breath shallow. The fire crackled softly as Cranmer leaned close. "If you cannot speak, Majesty, let it be enough if you press my hand and show that you die in faith." Slowly, painfully, Henry reached out. His fingers, once strong enough to wield a sword, now weak and trembling, grasped Cranmer's hand. For a moment, he held on, and then his hand went still. It was just after 2 a.m. on January 28th, 1547. The mighty Henry VIII, who had ruled England for nearly 4 decades, who had defied the Pope, slain his friends, executed his wives, and reshaped his nation through fire and blood, was dead. But even in death, his torment did not end. His corpse, bloated and filled with gas, was placed in a heavy coffin of lead. It was said that as the cortege made its slow journey to Windsor, the coffin began to leak, blood and fluids seeping out through the cracks. Legend claimed that dogs followed the procession, drawn by the smell, and that they licked the dripping remains of the once mighty king. It was a fitting end to a man consumed by both power and decay. When his body was finally laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he had ever truly loved, the court tried to move on, but whispers lingered. Some said the ghosts of his wives still haunted Whitehall. Others swore that on cold nights, the echo of Henry's voice could be heard, barking orders, cursing enemies, and crying out in pain. He had built a kingdom on his will alone, but in the end, even kings cannot escape the judgment of their own conscience. And so ended the reign of Henry VIII, a man who lived as a god and died as a monster, a man whose name still echoes through time as both the maker and destroyer of his own legend,